The typical logline on Hour of the Wolf is that it's Ingmar Bergman's horror movie, and I've always found that an odd distinction. Not because Hour of the Wolf isn't a horror movie, it's story of an isolated couple preyed upon by a sinister family, gothic castle, disturbing glimpses of violence, and climactic series of nightmarish visuals are all consistent with the genre. Bergman's camera creates horror even when nothing explicitly scary is happening. A scene where protagonists Johann and Elma join the mysterious von Merkens family for dinner goes from vaguely tense to flat-out horrific, thanks to the direction. The subjective point of view which introduces the von Merkens property is claustrophobic, trapping both the characters and the audience at the mercy of this strange family. The camera abandons a literal POV when the characters arrive at the dinner table, but the frantic whip pans back and forth as the soundtrack is overwhelmed by the slightly too loud chatter of the family, fuels a growing anxiety. Long before Mama Merkens has peeled off her own face, the film is looking to scare you. Hour of the Wolf is a horror movie. What I find odd is the notion that Hour of the Wolf is Bergman's only horror movie. We are talking about a man whose films are littered with ghoulish iconography and scenes of fright, from ghosts and witches to plagues and nightmares, from images of death and dying to the Grim Reaper himself. The bulk of Bergman's films are shot in shadowy black and white, and his most vibrant color film entombs its characters within a blood-red 19th century mansion. Bergman's movies sound scary, with piercing strings, apocalyptic overtures, and deafening silence. Moments where the characters have their screams stolen from them. Consider, too, the words critics and scholars use when discussing Bergman's cinema, and how commonly those same words are used to discuss horror cinema. But Bergman doesn't make horror movies. Curious. This attitude might, on some level, stem from genre bias. Ingmar Bergman is one of the great directors, a philosopher of the cinema, while horror has long carried a disreputable stigma as lowbrow trash. That's not true, of course. There is a long lineage of scary movies that are among the richest achievements in film history. More to the point, however classy a director Bergman might be, his films still bear many horror hallmarks. A full decade before Hour of the Wolf, The Magician would open on discussions of ghosts and ghouls, as a horse-drawn carriage arrives at a manor on a dark and stormy night. The film's collection of death imagery culminates with the supposedly deceased Vogler rising from the grave, a resurrection which elicits terror in the supervising physician. And Bergman's horror extends beyond his own filmography. Consider The Virgin Spring, a film about a young woman who is assaulted and killed by a gang, who then unknowingly take refuge with their victim's family. When the parents discover their guests have murdered their daughter, they take revenge, brutally killing the assailants. That story should sound familiar to horror aficionados, and that's because it would form the basis for the 70s exploitation horror film The Last House on the Left. The setting has been moved from medieval Sweden to America in the early 70s, but the basic outline is undeniable, and other details are carried over too. Both movies include a scene where the daughter gazes upon her own reflection, and both see the daughter gifted some piece of apparel from their parents, an item which will eventually give the killer's identities away in the third act. The Last House on the Left does open with a title card which implies the film's events are based on a true story, which they're not, and this doesn't have an equivalent in The Virgin Spring. But do you know what movie does open with text which implies the narrative is based on a true story when it really isn't? Hour of the Wolf. And that trope of implying your scary story actually happened would again be used by the likes of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Blair Witch Project, and The Strangers. Bergman's horror influence deepens. Indeed, not only would The Last House on the Left launch the career of horror director Wes Craven, but the film was itself remade in 2009. How many auteurs from the international art house can say they kickstarted a horror franchise? Comparing The Virgin Spring with its two remakes helps clarify what about the story frightened Ingmar in the first place. The American movies fixate on the graphic violence. Mary's assault is elaborate and prolonged, a grueling series of humiliations and violations, seemingly without end, extended by failed escape attempts which allow the gang to respond with further brutality. The parents' revenge is equally elaborate, a drawn-out showdown against a sadistic villain with an escalation of weapons and traps. That escalation continues between versions. The Craven movie saw the dad wield a shotgun and a chainsaw. The remake upgrades to hammers to the skull, or heads in microwaves until they explode. These are films which wallow in suffering and bloodshed. In The Virgin Spring, violence is cruel, but restrained. Bergman spends several minutes building the danger Karen is in, but the actual assault lasts just over a minute, captured in a handful of static shots, which silently observe the horror. The cruelty is evident without being fetishized. Even the killing blow is rendered off camera, Bergman instead devoting time to Karin's final moments of powerless terror, rather than violence itself. The climactic revenge is also clumsy and awkward, with any potential glory or satisfaction from the killings immediately undone by Tor's murder of a child. There's no fun in violence for Bergman, and unlike Craven's film, which stops immediately after vengeance is achieved, The Virgin Spring continues. Tor, consumed with guilt, sets off to find the resting place of his daughter, and pleads forgiveness from God, pledging to build a church on the spot of Karin's murder in penance for his sins. After a moment, a spring rushes forth from where Karin's body lay, and the family falls to their knees in piety, as a non-diegetic hymn plays the film out. This spiritual torment is at the heart of The Virgin Spring's horror. Not merely that horrific violence occurs, but how that violence could possibly be reconciled with the existence of God. Tor and Marietta's devout Christianity has not spared them tragedy. Karin isn't even the first child they've lost. An early dialogue scene alludes to a previous child death which still weighs on the parents. Fealty to God makes no difference, nor indeed does sin. The world doesn't end when Tor kills. It goes on, and the family is left to grasp for meaning themselves. Maybe Karin's death stemmed from Tor's lack of discipline, or Marietta's jealousy of Karin's deep affection for her father. Or maybe the fault lies with the family servant and her secret worship of Norse god Odin rather than Jesus Christ. But the most terrifying possibility is that there is no reason at all. Karin's death was little more than human cruelty, and neither piety nor sin makes any difference. Despite this darkness, scholars and critics tend to view The Virgin Spring's ending as a hopeful affirmation, the stream which bursts forth, a miracle. According to Marc Gervais, Tor is blessed by grace. His desolation has been the occasion for a far deeper, truer contact with God. I, however, reject this interpretation. For one, whatever serenity is offered by this supposed miracle is of little consolation next to the abject horror and violence Karin was subjected to. Moreover, the film has already linked Karin's death to the natural world, her murder immediately followed by a gentle snowfall. Is this God, or is this the indifference of nature, continuing irrespective of human morality? Perhaps the ending is a miracle, but the Virgin Spring cannot be sure, and it's that doubt which most scares Ingmar. But is Bergman trying to scare his audience? The theological questions which drive the Virgin Spring are inherently frightening, but are presented with contemplation rather than revulsion. Horror filmmaking is present in the movie, but only in spurts. The prelude to Karen's attack, which deliberately generates suspense, as the danger mounts and Karen slowly realizes her vulnerability. The servant's narrow escape from a lecherous old man. But horror is less the film's genre than a tool the Virgin Spring uses for ruminating on faith. This sporadic use of horror is evident in other Bergman films. For all the magician's spooky iconography, the film is also comical, a lighthearted farce on the plight of the artist, complete with elements of sex comedy and an improbable happy ending, where an invitation to perform for the king conveniently solves all of the troupe's problems. The big scary set piece cited earlier is in fact a ruse, an elaborate charade designed to trick the Doctor in retaliation for his exposing of Vogler's performance. The horror present is a knowing sham, and that gives the recreation of classic horror tropes a parodic quality. The climax might specifically be a parody of Diabolique's ending. Released 3 years before The Magician, this French horror film also builds to a supposed resurrection, which turns out to be a trick. But where Clouseau's trick was so terrifying it drove its mark to death, Vogler's charade only scares the Doctor for a fleeting moment. When the performance ends, so too does the fear.
Jag åstadkom lite dödsrädsla. Ingenting mer.
Just as the Virgin Spring uses horror as a tool in a broader thematic exploration, so too does The Magician. In this case, drawing on genre tropes to explore the trickery of the artist. For Bergman, the artist is a charlatan whose tools deceive their audience to create a temporary diversion. This deceit makes the relationship between artist and audience inherently contentious. The audience craves the entertainment the artist provides, yet resents the tricks they use to provide it, while the artist craves the audience to behold the spectacle of their art, but resents their criticism and snobbery. The Magician's climactic horror set piece embodies this tension, at once validating the efficacy of the artist's tricks and humiliating the audience, yet simultaneously stressing the impermanence of the art, returning the audience their authority and thus humiliating the artist. Resurrection, in this context, is a means to an end. Curiously, though, Bergman would return to this concept with Cries and Whispers, which also builds to a climactic scene where the recently dead returns to life. Except this time, it's no trick. After succumbing to a long bout with cancer, Agnes reawakens, her cries beckoning her caretaker and sisters to her bedside. Kevin flees in disgust, and though Maria tries to stand by her sister, the horror becomes too much to bear, and she too flees. Only Anna, the one who has cared for Agnes throughout her disease, has the strength to stay with her through this. Rather than the magician's escalating shock effects, this scene emphasizes dread. Each character is forced into slow confrontation with living death, and though Agnes seeks only comfort, her presence is too terrifying to comprehend. Resurrection is no joyous miracle, but a bastardized half-life which traps Agnes between realms. Consider the scene's eerie disconnect of body and spirit. We crucially never see the resurrected Agnes speak. Her voice is only heard off-camera, as though it were coming from a disembodied source, while her body lies dormant. It is inconceivable, logically and in the scene's formal construction, that this husk could produce the words we're hearing. And that disbelief fuels the uncanny horror as what remains of Agnes reaches up for Maria and clings once more to life. Bergman gives no explanation for the scene. Perhaps it is a dream, as Anna suggests, or a vision. Perhaps it only exists metaphorically, the starkest juxtaposition of the selfishness of Agnes's sisters against Anna's love and sacrifice. Or maybe it all literally does happen. The lack of acknowledgement afterwards, a further extension of this family's refusal to face their responsibilities to Agnes. Whatever the case, one thing that is real to Ingmar is the horror. Agnes's resurrection is not waved aside as trickery, nor can any aspect of the scene be described as parody. It is a pointed evocation of horror. Fear is paramount to Cries and Whispers. The fear of dying and what lies beyond, fear of being forgotten, fear of failing your loved ones in their most desperate time of need. Bergman may view horror primarily as a tool of his artistry rather than a subject in and of itself, but it is a tool he keenly understands. This understanding is evident in Hour of the Wolf. Beyond the film's spooky aesthetics and tale of nightmarish powerlessness against a mysterious evil, Bergman also makes direct visual references to monster movies, specifically to the Universal canon. A surreal moment where the von Merkens family unveil a miniature stage and a tiny person performs an excerpt from Mozart's The Magic Flute echoes the shrunken experiments of Dr. Pretorius in Bride of Frankenstein, and creates a similarly inexplicable shock to the system. Lindhorst also holds a striking resemblance to Bela Lugosi's Dracula, with his short, slicked-back black hair and narrow face, and Bergman lights Lindhorst to emphasize these similarities. The film does not explicitly state the family are vampires, and even contradicts traditional vampire lore, but the depiction of a cultish family of aristocrats hoarded away in their castle does bear some resemblance to the Dracula mythos. The von Merkens patriarch is a baron rather than a count, but that sense of royalty is shared. Also shared is a dinner scene where the villain lures their future victim in for a meal, all the while grooming them for their eventual subjugation. Like Dracula with Renfield, the von Merkens do not seek to destroy Johann, but to seduce him, to consume his personage by appealing to his desires. These connections to vampirism might seem modest or incidental, but consider that Hour of the Wolf is very much a direct follow-up to Bergman's Persona, a film which is even more explicit in drawing on vampiric imagery. This literal blood-sucking is foreshadowed in the scene where Elizabeth approaches Alma in bed. Alma stirs from her slumber, as if under a spell, her awakening mirrored by Elizabeth's head turn. Alma offers herself to Elizabeth, who holds the obedient woman within her power. Virtually everything about the scene, from the hazy cinematography, the women in nightgowns, an intruder arriving in the bedroom, and the mixture of eerie power and erotic seduction, evokes the long lineage of Dracula movies from the 1920s through to the 1960s. The final shot is framed as though the women are gazing in the mirror, but no reflections are shown. An interesting choice, given a certain quirk in vampire lore. Just a few minutes later, when Alma learns Elizabeth has been studying her for a role, Alma stares at her reflection, as if to assure herself that she's still human. In this interpretation, vampirism is fundamentally linked to Elizabeth's role as an actress. Studying Alma to prepare for a part is a form of feeding off her, drawing Alma's life force to bolster Elizabeth's own power. Except, it's not quite that simple. Just as Elizabeth feeds off Alma, so too does Alma feed off Elizabeth. The mute actress proves a rather captive audience for Alma to vent her anxieties, opinions, and deepest held desires, drawing power from Elizabeth's forced companionship. Just as Elizabeth preyed upon Alma at night, so too does Alma longingly hover over Elizabeth's neck as the latter sleeps. Even the blood-sucking is not an unprompted attack. Alma offers Elizabeth her blood, who in turn partakes, the two bound in symbiotic ritual. As the title implies, Persona is all about the blurring distinctions between Alma and Elizabeth, collapsing their individual identities into a shared whole. And this blurring informs the vampires in Hour of the Wolf. These characters aren't just preying on Johann, they are Johann. Specifically, they're Johann's narcissistic self-obsession. The von Merkens endlessly praise Johann's art and genius, push him towards destroying his wife and embracing an affair with an old lover. That these urges prove self-destructive, Johann left sexually humiliated, alienated, and driven to madness, reveal Bergman's own fears as an artist of succumbing to a self-destructive vanity. Persona and Hour of the Wolf are both linked by their vampiric exploration of identity, and both can be further joined by The Magician, as a trilogy on the horror of the artist. Putting these films together illustrates what scares Ingmar Bergman, each film expressing a different fear of himself as an artist, as charlatan, as leech, and as self-absorbed narcissist. And that also reveals why Bergman isn't thought of as a horror director. Put simply, his fears are too abstract. The scary thing about Hour of the Wolf is how the film uses vampiric imagery to express the anxieties of an artist battling his vices and metaphorical demons. You know what's scary about Dracula? There's a vampire sucking people's blood. I don't mean to make an appeal in anti-intellectualism. Horror movies have always been underpinned by metaphor and social commentary. But there's also a visceral threat. Even in the modern crop of A24 and A24-inspired, so-called elevated horror movies, which wear their metaphors on their sleeve and bring subtext up to the level of text, those fears still manifest in a literal threat. Bergman seldom does this. His horrors remain abstractions. I speculated earlier that anti-genre bias might play a role in Bergman's lack of placement in the horror canon, but that goes both ways. Bergman's films, even at their scariest, do not evoke that fear the way normal horror movies do, and under those expectations, his work might be disappointing. If you're one of the 1% of teenagers who watch my videos, try bringing Hour of the Wolf to your next slumber party and see how well that goes. You will probably not be thought of as the cool kid, though you will have earned my respect. In spite of everything, however, I still think it's erroneous to call Hour of the Wolf Bergman's only horror movie. Sure, Bergman isn't the typical go-to when you're craving a scary movie, but his films still hold a haunting power that under the right circumstances can still absolutely terrify. Just think, it's Hallows Eve. The trick-or-treaters have all gone to bed. The jack-o'-lanterns have gone out, and you're alone in the dead of night, accompanied only by the rustling of wind in the trees and the glow of a Bergman film on the television. Slowly, you're drawn in, little by little.
Oh, man.
When suddenly...
No sleep bedeutet.